Good morning and welcome to day 6 of our book talk of Reflections on Race. I'm going to take a moment at this time and I'm going to do what Facebook already does, but I'm going to build my audience with people who have been listening in. So I'm just taking a moment to invite some people into this space. Good morning to those of you who are coming in. All right. And just taking a moment to invite some people. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. This is a great day to be alive. This is a great day to be in the land of the living. Having a little bit of a scratchy throat today. Good morning. So I'm going to try to rectify that before we get to moving. If you are with us today, you can say good morning or type it in the comments, or you can put a thumbs up so I know that you are in the space with us today. Excuse me. We have been getting some great feedback from this book talk, and hopefully people have been able to go to the links that were given on yesterday's talk and look at the data and look at the historical research that has been done, so that you know that neither Tim Wise nor I am just making up commentary as we go. So though, for those of you who are new into the room, we are reading White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. This is our book talk that we are currently on. We are going to be moving on to another book after we finish this one. And if you look on my profile pic, you'll actually see the next book advertised, which is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. But currently we are reading White Like Me by Tim Wise, who is an anti-racism activist. And we are on day 6 of this reading. And we are looking at Tim Wise's life as he is telling it memoir style. And he is now talking about his early years of schooling, preschool into elementary. And it's going to be interesting to see what you guys get out of today's book talk as we go into looking further at his life. So let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for all the many wonderful things that you've done for us. Thank you, God, for keeping us. Thank you for keeping our friends and our family. As we take this time to dive into this word today, I ask, Father, that you open our eyes, give us ears to hear, give us eyes to see, give us your wisdom and understanding as we analyze and look at this life, this one solitary life that has made so much of a difference in the field of race relations. Amen. All right. So again, you can type good morning if you're in the room with us, or you can put a thumbs up to let us know that you can see and hear clearly. Again, you can type in good morning, or you can put a thumbs up to let us know that you can see and hear clearly. We're going to go right into our reading, picking up where we left off with his schooling in his early years. And I'll let the airplane pass by. All right. I can't remember much about my time at TSU, although I can vividly recall the layout of the class, the playground, and the drive to and from our Green Hills home each morning and afternoon to get back and forth. But despite the vagueness of my TSU memories, I can't help but think that the experience had a profound impact on my life, especially as I would come to understand and relate to the subject of race. On the one hand, being subordinated to Black authority at an early age was a blessing. In a society that has long encouraged whites to disregard Black wisdom, for a white child to learn at the age of 3 to listen to Black women and do what they ask of you and to believe that they know of what they speak can be more than a minor life lesson. Now, I would happen to say that is entirely true. Um, One of the things that I have noted as an educator is for at least the last 5 years, I have come across students, especially on the high school level, who came to me and who would say things like, I've never had a Black teacher. Now, to understand that, you got to say, why haven't you had a Black teacher? You're all the way in high school. You passed by, excuse me. Sorry about that. Let me turn this down. You have passed by, listen, you've passed by preschool, you passed by elementary school, and you passed by middle school with various subjects, and you've never had a Black teacher. I don't think this sometimes people understand, as Tim was saying here, that he got a life lesson at an early age that some people still don't have as adults, right? This notion that a person of color in authority, that you should respect that authority, that you should, if they're a teacher or educator or whatever, that you should actually, as he says here, not disregard the wisdom of that person because of the color of their skin. But he is saying something that I think is very important here. He's pointing out the fact that his parents intentionally put him into an environment where he would have people that were authority figures that were people that didn't look like him. So he learned at an early age not to disregard the authority or the instruction or the wisdom of a person of color. And so for me, I think, it was the first time that I ever heard a student say, that I had never had a Black teacher. I had never seen a Black assistant teacher in the classroom. And so for some of the students that I encountered, it took a while for them to receive me as a figure of authority. Why? Because they weren't used to seeing one. They weren't used to having to do what a teacher who was of color was telling them to do. Matter of fact, I love the fact that children are very, very honest. Many of them, most of them are. And they went further to say this. This is what they said. We have never had a teacher of color, but we have seen plenty of cafeteria workers that are Black and plenty of janitorial staff that are Black. So for them it was a novelty to have somebody who looked like them presenting information that was educational. Matter of fact, some of the students that I worked with actually had to get reprimanded. They actually had to be brought in with me and another staff member, and that staff member, who was Caucasian, had to say to them, listen, this woman has as much authority as I do in the classroom, and you will listen and you will follow instructions. But my thing is, that should have never had to occur. Because if you are teaching and training and instructing your child, right, that they are to follow the directions of those who are in authority. And we're not talking about blind allegiance. You know, we're not talking about just following adults just to follow them, right? But we're just talking about basic authority. And the fact that it took these young people, some of them, quite a bit of time to realize that, okay, this person is in a position of authority. And some of the things that I might want to say, or some of the things I might want to express, because of that place of authority, I've now got to shift my gears on how I respond. And so I think it's very important that Tim points out that he learned at an early age to listen and to do what they ask of you and to believe that they know of what they speak. That was a major life lesson to me. It wasn't a minor one, it was a major one. Someone tagged me this morning on something that was very similar, and I want to go back and I wanted to address them, because I wanted to tell the young lady it actually happens across professions. She was on a plane, and there was a passenger that was going into a medical fit or whatever and needed medical attention. Well, she's a medical doctor, black woman. She's a medical doctor, and she hopped up, got out of her seat, and she was going to proceed to help the person. And she said one of the stewardesses stopped her and was like, "Oh no, sweetheart, you sit down, and she kept being interrupted as she tried to tell this stewardess that she was a doctor, that she could actually help. And as she told the stewardess, then the stewardess began to give her this litany of questions. What kind of doctor are you? Where are you from? Why are you on this flight? I mean, just the whole nine. And another gentleman, she said, who was a white male doctor, jumped up as well to go help the passenger. And the stewardess kind of said, "Oh, okay, we got it now." But she never asked the other gentleman for any of his credentials. And so, again, these are kind of things that happen across the board if you are a black professional. A lot of times people try to question the validity or want documentation from you as to what you have done, but your white counterparts many times never get questioned. Their validity never gets questioned. They don't get asked for certifications and papers, et cetera, et cetera. So just this morning, someone tagged me in that example, and that, she was going to follow up with the airline about how she was treated, because that was a life and death situation for that passenger on the plane. And here this woman is, giving her the rundown, totally ignoring the fact that, this person could be helped. And she was very, welcoming of the other professional and didn't ask them, that's the key, didn't ask them for any of the information that she had asked her for. So again, very, very good lesson. He says here, it would mean that a little more than 20 years later, listening to African American women in public housing in New Orleans tell me about their lives and struggles, I would not be the white guy who looked them square in the face and inquired as to whether it might be possible that they had lost their minds. I would not be the white guy who assumed they were exaggerating, making things up, or fabricating the difficulties of their daily routine. I would go back to that early imprinting and remember that people know their lives better than I do, including those whom the society has ignored for so long. I've spoken to, of course, many African Americans who simply say, when I experience discrimination, many times I don't bother to tell people what I've experienced, or as many times as I have experienced it, or how I have experienced it, because of the things that some of the things that Tim Wise listed here. People assume that you are exaggerating, that you are making things up, that you are fabricating your difficulties. And so Again, he makes a great point here that he looks back on his upbringing, and he says that upbringing helped shape the way that he would listen to people of color in the future. Attending preschool at TSU also meant that I would be socialized in a non-dominant setting. My peers, mostly African American children. Because I had bonded with Black kids early on, once I entered elementary school, it would be hard not to notice the way that we were so often separated in the classroom. By tracking that placed the white children in more advanced tracks, by unequal discipline, and by a very different way in which the teachers would relate to us. At Burton Elementary, with the exception of the African American teachers, most of the educators would have had very little experience teaching Black children, and in some cases, very little interest in doing so. At one point in my first grade year, the teacher would actually pawn off the task to my mother, who had no teaching background, but who knew that unless she intervened to work with the African American students, they would receive very little instruction in the classroom. I can attest to this as an educator that this does happen. I can attest to the fact that I've gotten into plenty of verbal rows with people about how they treat children of color in the classroom. So yeah, I can definitely attest to this, that some students are placed in advanced tracks, while other students are, left as if they don't have the potential of another student. And so as educators, you do have to push when you see systemic racial issues happening, when you see schedule issues happening. There was a couple of students that, in terms of high school and on the counseling side, when I recognized that their counselors were choosing to not give them information regarding scholarships, not meet with them one-to-one. I did go to some counselors and address that. I also helped those students out and gave them the information that they needed and told them where they needed to go, and helped them with college recommendations, things that their counselors should have been doing. But when you see that their counselors are not stepping up, and they're spending all their time with the white students, giving them all of the information, you do what you can as a teacher. You do what you can with the information that you have. So one of the things that I encourage educators is to get involved. When you see injustices happen, or when you see discrimination happening, or when you see things happening academically that should not be happening with children of color, don't just stand there or sit there like a frog on the log. Do your part when you know what needs to be done. That's just a little plug. While few white children at such an age would have noticed the racial separation going on, I couldn't help but see it, Tim says. These were my friends, a few of whom I had been at TSU with. Even the Black kids I hadn't known before were the ones with whom I would identify thanks to my TSU experience. Although I hardly had a word to describe what was going on, I knew that whatever it was came at a cost to me. It was separating me from the people in whom I'd had some investment. Although the injury was far more profound to them, after all, the institutional racism at the heart of that unequal treatment wasn't aimed in my direction, but theirs. I was nonetheless the collateral damage. My mother had never tried to push me into whiteness or put me into a socially determined space. But what she would not do, the schools would strive for from the very beginning. Yes. Whatever racial separation the school system sought to impose, even in a post-segregation era, yes, even in a post-segregation era, it was something against which I struggled for years. I had a few white friends, but very few. Albert Jones, who is still my best friend to this day, was among the only white classmates with whom I bonded at that time. Was among the only white classmates. Frankly, even that might have been a case of mistaken identity. Though white, his dad worked at TSU in the School of Education, so even he had a connection to the Black community that made him different. But other than Albert, pretty much all of my friends at Burton were Black. Yet, as I would discover, interpersonal connections to racial others say little about whether or not one is having experiences similar to those. Even when a white person is closely tied to African Americans, that white person is often living in an entirely different world from that of their friends, though we rarely realize it. Yes, I call it the racial parallel universe, that two students can be in the same class with the same teacher, even taking the same course, and they can be receiving two different experiences at the same time. It would be early 1977 in third grade that I received one of my earliest lessons about race, even if the meaning of that lesson wouldn't sink in for several years. The persons who served as my instructors that day were not teachers, but two friends, Bobby Orr and Vincent Perry, whose understanding of the dynamics of race, of their Blackness and my whiteness was so deep that they were able to afford me the lesson during something as meaningless as afternoon recess. It was a brisk winter day, and Bobby, Vince, and I were tossing a football back and forth. One of us would get between the other two, who stood at a distance of maybe 10 yards from each other, and try to intercept the ball as it flew through the air, one passer to the next. Football had really never been my game. Though I was athletic and obsessed with sports, I was also pretty small as a kid. As such, I saw little point in a game that involved running into people and being tackled. Because we were so often separated in the classroom, I treasured whatever time I could carve out with my Black friends. Our game began innocently enough, and Bobby in the middle, usually picking off passes between Vince and me. Next, it was Vince's turn, and he too picked off several of the passes between Bobby and me, though the zip with which he delivered them often made the ball bounce off Vince's hands too hot to handle. When it came time for me to be in the middle, I frankly had expectation about how many passes I could intercept. My size alone virtually ensured that if Vince and Bobby wanted to, they could simply throw the ball over my head so long as they did it high enough and fast enough. There would be very little opportunity for me to pull the ball down. But strangely, I caught every ball. Each time they would pass it just a bit beyond my reach, and I would jump to one side or the other, hauling their efforts into my breast, never dropping a single one or allowing even one pass in 30 to make it past me. At first, I reveled in what I assume must be my newfound speed and agility. What's more, I beamed with pride at the smiles on their faces, assuming they were impressed with my effort. And I continued to interpret this series of events as evidence of my own abilities, even as they both began to repeat the same refrain after every pass, beginning with about the 10th throw of the series. As the ball left Bobby's hand and whizzed toward Vince's, only to be thwarted again by my leaping effort, they would repeat, one and then the other, the same exclamation, "My nigger Tim." Pop, the ball would once again reverberate as it hit my hands and was pulled in for another interception. "My nigger Tim." I would toss it back and we would repeat the dance. Pop, another catch. "My nigger Tim." At the first dozen times they said this, each time with more emphasis and a bit of a laugh, I began to sense that something was going on, the meaning of which I didn't quite understand. A strange feeling began to creep over me, punctuated by a voice in the back of my head saying something about being suckered. Not to mention, I instinctively felt odd about being called a nigger. And note, it was indeed that derivation of the term and not the more relaxed, even amiable NIGGA, which was being deployed. Because it was a word I would never use and which I knew to be a slur of the most vile nature, let's face it, because I was white and I had never been called that before. Though I remained uncomfortable with the exchange for several minutes, I quickly put it behind me as the bell rang, recess ended, and we headed back to class, laughing and talking about something unrelated to the drama that had been played out on the ball field. If I ever thought of the event in the days afterward, I likely contented myself with the thought that although their word choice seemed odd, they were only signifying that I was one of the club, so to speak, and I had proven myself to them. Well, I was right about one thing. They were definitely signifying a term for the cultural practice of verbal put downs that have long been a form of street poetry in Black communities of this nation. As it turns out, it would be almost 20 years before I finally understood the meaning of this day's events. And that understanding would come while watching television. It was there that I saw a Black comedian doing a bit about making some white guy his nigger and getting him to do whatever he, the Black comic, wanted. To jump when he said jump, to come running when he was told to come running, to step and fetch it, so to speak. So there it was. On that afternoon, so many years before, Bobby and Vince had been able to flip the script on the racial dynamic that would every other day serve as the background noise for their lives. On that day, they were able to make me not only a nigger, but their nigger. The irony couldn't have been more perfect, nor the satisfaction, I suppose, in having exacted a small measure of payback, not necessarily from me, since at that age I had done little to deserve it, but of my people, and writ large. It was harmless, and for them it had been fun, a cat and mouse routine with the white boy who doesn't realize he's being used, and not just used, but used in a way some folks had long been used and were still being used every day. Today, Tim, you are the nigger. You are the one who gets to jump and run, huff and puff. Today, we laugh not with you, but at you. We like you and all that, but today you belong to us. As I thought about it, however, I was overcome with a profound sadness, and not because I had been tricked or played for a fool. That's happened lots of times, usually at the hands of other white folks. I was saddened by what I realized in that moment, which was very simply this. Even at the age of 9, Bobby and Vince had known what it meant to be someone's nigger. They knew more than how to say the word. They knew how to use it, when to use it, how to contextualize it, and fashion it into a weapon. And the only way they could have known any of this is because they had either been told of its history and meaning and had been called it before, or they had seen and heard a loved one called it before, none of which options were better than the others. Even as the school system we shared was every day treating Bobby and Vince as that thing they now call me, disciplining them more harshly, or placing them in remedial level groups, no matter their abilities. On the playground, they could turn it around and claim it for themselves, the power to define my reality and thereby gain a brief respite from what was happening in our class. Yet the joke was on them in the end, because once recess was over and the ball was back in the hands of the teachers, they were none prepared to make me the nigger. It had been white privilege and Black oppression that had made the joke funny in the first place, or even decipherable, and it would likewise be white privilege and Black oppression that would make it irrelevant and even a bit pathetic. But folks take their victories where they can find them, and some of us find them more often than others. I was never a very good student. No matter my reading level or general ability, I had a hard time applying myself to subject matter that I didn't find interesting. In effect, I treated school like a set of noise-canceling headphones, letting in the sounds I was interested in hearing while shutting out the rest. By middle school, I was struggling academically, finding myself bored and looking desperately for something else to occupy my time. Given the home in which I lived, it was hardly surprising that I would settle on theater. Growing up in a home where my father was always on stage, and even when he wasn't, had provided me with a keen sense of timing, delivery of what was funny and what wasn't, and how to move on stage, of how to do nothing well, as my theater teacher in high school would put it. I grew up memorizing lines to plays I would never perform simply because my dad had saved all the scripts from shows he had done in the past. These plays dealt with adult themes, many of which I didn't understand, but which I pretended to, just in case anyone ever needed a 10-year-old to play the part of Paul Bratter in Barefoot in the Park. At Stokes School in 5th grade, I would finally have the chance to take a theater class as an elective. The teacher, Susan Moore, was among the most eccentric persons I'd ever met. We didn't study much in terms of theater technique. For good or bad, Susan thought it best to just throw us into the process of doing theater and learning as we went. So she would pick a play and we would work on it for the better part of a year, reading it, learning it, and then finally producing and performing it. The good thing about this process was that it led to fairly sophisticated outcomes, at least for 5th and 6th graders. When you have 10 and 11-year-olds pulling off Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew and never dropping a line, you know you're doing something special. As the male lead in that production, I can attest to feeling older and wiser than my years for having done it. On the downside, unless you got one of the coveted roles in the play chosen for that year by Mrs. Moore, your participation in the theater group would be circumscribed. Occasionally, she would create a few characters and script a few lines for them so that as many kids as possible could get a chance to be on stage. But this hardly flattened their hierarchy of the club. There were the actors and there was everyone else. The students who would work the lights, pull the curtains, or just hang out and perhaps help the actors run lines and maybe just quit theater altogether and find something else to do. Having an actor for a father pretty well assured me of a prominent role in whatever production was chosen as our annual play. Ms. Moore could presume my talent, and although that talent may have been genuine, there were certainly no cold readings or auditions in her class. A few of us would pretty much rotate. I would be the male lead in one play, and in the next production, that honor would go to Albert. The female leads would also pretty much rotate between 2 girls in our class. It was a fairly closed circle. In 6th grade, we would switch from Shakespeare to You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Albert nor I could sing. The fact that we could neither sing should have guaranteed that it would be our turn to pull curtains or some such other thing in the class. But despite our lack of ability, we were cast as Charlie and Linus, respectively. In my case, Mrs. Moore actually agreed to take the song out of the play altogether because I made clear that I was terrified to sing a solo in public. My ability to force script changes was not about race, of course, but my ability to be in the position I was and therefore to make that kind of demand and gain the director's agreement most assuredly was about race, at least in part. Had I been anything but white, it would have been highly unlikely that I would have gotten the parts I landed in any of the productions done in that or any other school. These were roles that were written for white actors. Shakespeare's work is not, to be sure, replete with black characters, and there are only so many times a school can do Othello. Likewise, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown was written before the introduction of the comic strip's one black character, Franklin. Although Miss Moore added a few lines to the script and had a black kid deliver them in the person of Franklin, and created an entirely new character for Carol Stewart, one of the few black students in the theater class, this hardly altered the racial dynamic. To be white at that school, as in many others, was to have a whole world of extracurricular opportunity open to myself, a world where if you were a mediocre student, as I was, you could still find a niche and outlet for your talents, your passions, and your interests. To be of color at that same school was to ensure that no matter how good an actor or actress you were capable of becoming, you were unlikely to be in a position to avail yourself of the same outlet for your creativity. Now that I have read all of that, I want to talk a little bit about what he's sharing here, because I went to a magnet elementary school and I went to a magnet middle school, so I know exactly what he's describing here. He's saying, if you're a mediocre white male, there is plenty of opportunity for you to have outlets for your gifts, not just with theater, but with dance, with music, with choral music, with visual arts. There are, and still are to this day, lots of racial bias in the arts. Just look at what we just saw on the professional level that came out this week, I believe, with the pay scale. Actors of color, right, making like 7, 8 times less than their Caucasian counterparts, and their shows are doing better in the ratings, and their shows have gotten awards, and their pay is much, not just a little less, but much less per episode for the same kinds of work that they're doing. So what he's describing here on the elementary school and the middle school level, it happens on all levels. And he's saying that because of the kinds of curriculum that his teacher was picking out, because of the kinds of plays that they were doing, they were written for white actors. So even in looking at what his teacher was picking out, right, if she wanted to include everybody, or if she wanted to give everybody a fair hand at trying acting, rather than, as he said, having some students who just work lights or just pull curtains, right, or just help the main actors run lines. Can you imagine? I couldn't imagine having a passion for theater and the only thing I could do in her classroom was work lights and pull curtains. Because as an educator, she wasn't interested in giving me curriculum that would have developed that gift on the inside of me. That's what you call a nightmare for a student who has a passion for theater. Those are the kinds of things that happen in a classroom that could drive a really talented student to become trouble in your class. Those are the kinds of things that could also drive a really talented student to just stop coming to your class altogether or skip school because they're not being challenged. And as Tim Wise says here, because he recognized that had it been any other kind of school, right? He's telling you he knew that it was because of who he was as a white male that he was getting these opportunities. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. Unless a theater teacher is prepared to violate the aesthetic sensibilities of the audience, which is rare, and cast a person of color in a role traditionally played by a white person, like Romeo, Juliet, Hamlet, or Snoopy even, to try to cast them, Black, Latino, and Asian kids in that class are just out of luck. How do we change this? Well, a part of it is creating our own spaces for us to be appreciated. Because if you're working within a system, right, it's a little more difficult for you to negotiate what you want when you're working in someone else's system. This is why, when the whole thing came out about the whole Oscars so white, most of the people were saying Stop waiting on white people to congratulate you for your acting abilities. Create a system, create something that celebrates you. And of course, there are award shows out there that celebrate Black actors, but that was one of the things that came out, was that stop waiting around for certain organizations to give you your props. Create your own. Applaud yourself. So we're going to continue reading. This, it should be noted, is no mere accident point. Theater was a life raft for me in middle school, without which I might well have gone under altogether. My ability to access it and the whiteness that granted me that ability was no minor consideration. By the time middle school began, my home life was increasingly chaotic. My father's drinking had gone well past heavy and on to a serious alcoholism. Though my mother absorbed nightly verbal blows and tried her best to shield me from damage, each fight, each hateful word, each guttural expression of contempt cut deeply into my sense of personal security. So I took to closing myself off in my room after school most days. When my father was around, I would only come out to eat dinner, always making sure to be back in my own personal space shortly thereafter, as the drinking continued and the fights were sure to begin. I could know, at least for that night, as I would move closer and view him after drinking, that he wasn't going to kill himself. I could go to sleep. Things got so bad at one point that I began to keep track with hash marks on a page the number of days in a row that he had been drinking. Though I longed for a closer relationship with my dad, I also breathed more easily whenever he was in a play out of town. But then I had learned that quiet loneliness is always preferable to amplified togetherness when the cacophony to which you've been exposed reverberates with the blaring notes of marital discord. Only by escaping into the world of acting was I able to make it through those grades at all. It was my refuge. I could lock myself in my room with a play script, avoid my father, escape the smell of whiskey or bad vodka on his breath, and avoid the battles that were the hallmark of his relationship with my mother. The only times I would come out of my room were in those moments when I honestly felt that if I didn't, he might kill her. No matter the infrequency of physical abuse in my mind, the threat always seemed to hang like a thundercloud over our home. At one point, I was so sure he would kill her that I began planning an escape route. If I could intervene and save her, I would. But if it became apparent that I wouldn't be able to do much good, I knew how to get my bedroom window open fast and exactly where I would run to get help. That my dad was not going to kill my mother was hardly the point. When you hear him say he's going to, like the one time he said it with a steak knife held 3 inches from her face, while I watched from perhaps 7 feet away, and you're a child and you're in no position to deconstruct the context of his words, all you can do is spend precious moments of your youth trying to figure out ways to save your mom's life, or at least your own. So when I say that theater was a life raft, I am not engaging in idle hyperbole. I meant it literally. Without it, I would have had no escape. While my physical existence may have continued, after all, my father never killed anyone in the end, and had he meant to, it's doubtful I could have dissuaded him with a play. Theater was how I released my frustrations. It was how I avoided falling into clinical depression. It was how I got my mind off of other things, like killing my father before he could harm my mom, which I did contemplate in more panicked moments. Without theater, I could only access the way I did because I was white. It is a very open question how my life would have gone if all the other variables had been the same, but I had been anything other than white, and thereby deprived of the diversion offered by acting. I feel confident that things would have gone differently than they did. As for my father, he should be grateful that we were white and that I had an outlet. This is the end of our reading for today. One of the things that Tim Wise is driving in the point of, he's saying, is that because he was white and because of the way that his teacher ran his class, he was able to have an outlet that allowed him to not get into trouble. And most people who are in education know and will tell you that one of the first things that they cut in education budgets almost across the board, across the country, one of the things that they cut first is what? The arts. Whether it's the music program, the visual arts program, the dance program, the drama program, and they usually relegate those things to what we might call after school activities. Or in the school that I was at last, they would have them like art clubs or arts clubs, and they would meet once a quarter. Really? One time every 3 months. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that Tim points out as we close today is he's pointing out the power of the arts, the power of the arts. And at the same time, he's pointing out the fact that because he was a white male, he was giving opportunities in the arts that otherwise probably should have gone to a more gifted student. But because of the way that his teachers were setting up the curriculum, most of the material that she picked, right, fit the white male. So that's why he got a lot of opportunity. But he was saying for himself that what if he was a black student who wasn't getting that opportunity? What if he was that same student that was an African American male that was being ignored in that same class, that was just pulling curtains and helping the white actors run their lines, and lived in an abusive home with a parent that was continually drunk all the time, that was fighting with the mother? What he's saying is his reality might have turned out very, very differently. Exactly. He's showing you through his life that there were opportunities that were given that fit him as a student. And you know, as an educator, that's definitely something that educators need to look at. What kinds of curriculum, what kinds of things are you doing in your classroom that is giving opportunity to all your students? Now, I've worked in you know, different settings, and I worked at a school at one point where the entire student body was dyslexic. The entire student body was ADD and ADHD. So in that school setting, we learned what we call modalities. We learned how to adjust our one lesson plan to maybe 15 different students. We learned how to adjust to the way that that student learned, and we learned how to give opportunities to those students so that they would not feel left out. But I can tell you right now that not every teacher learns that, and not every teacher is trained in that way. So I think it's very good that Tim Wise points these things out, the power of the arts to keep kids engaged, to keep kids involved, to keep kids out of trouble. And when you start cutting those kinds of programs, then the kids that are really passionate about those things, or the kids that are really in school because they have an opportunity and an outlet through arts, you lose those kids many times. So this was today's reading. I hope that you got something out of it, and we are going to continue tomorrow with Tim Wise's travel through his schooling. I do believe that we're running next into his high school schooling, as well as a little bit about his college life. So that's where we are going tomorrow. I want to say thank you all for joining me live. And think about that. Think about If you have sons and daughters, nieces and nephews, I would say take some time and think about, you know, what kinds of courses they take. Ask them, what is the art situation like in your school? Who gets the parts? If it's drama, music, dance, is it the same students that they're always asking to have certain parts? Do you think it's because they're gifted, or do you think it's another reason behind it? And so having these conversations, especially with your young adults in your life, I think that you will find some interesting answers to those questions. This has been another book talk, Reflections on Race. I hope to see you back here tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care and God bless. Again, thank you so much for joining us in our book talk for today. I hope that you will join us again. Take care and God bless.